On November 16th, 1957, officers in Plainfield, Wisconsin walked into one of the most gruesome crime scenes in history. On a remote farm, they found a house decorated with the body parts of women. There were waste paper baskets made from heads, chairs upholstered with human skin, masks made from shriveled faces. It was a house of horrors unlike anything the state had seen before, and it was all the work of one man, Ed Gein. A local part-time handyman and full-time weirdo loner, Ed Gein was also a cannibal serial killer who'd go down in history as the Butcher of Plainfield. The inspiration for Norman Bates in Psycho, Leatherface in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and Buffalo Bill in Silence of the Lambs, Gein's crimes were so horrific that his spectre still haunts the nightmares of present-day America. But who really was this monster, and how did he become quite so disturbed? Well, today we're taking you on a journey into the mind of the original Psycho. From the moment Edward Theodore Gein came into the world on August 27, 1906, he was destined for an awful life. The second son of George Philip and Augusta Gein, young Edward's childhood home was haunted by the twin demons of alcohol and religious fanaticism. Father George Philip was a crippling alcoholic whose tiny self-worth couldn't even be detected by the most powerful electron microscope. Mother Augusta was a hardcore religious nut who saw sin and filth everywhere. Alongside his older brother Henry, young Ed was taught that the city of La Crosse was a haven of sodomites and harlots. They were also taught that they were completely worthless. When Augusta wasn't verbally abusing the boys, she was bullying her drunken husband. Despite this, or maybe perhaps because of it, Ed came to idolize her. In 1915, Augusta moved the family from the leafy Sodom of La Crosse to the quiet Gomorrah of Plainfield, Wisconsin. A tiny town in the heart of deer hunting country, Plainfield can be summed up by 3 adjectives: flat, empty, and anonymous. Unless, of course, you're Augusta Gein, in which case those adjectives were sinful, sinful, and even more sinful. From their secluded farmhouse on the edge of town, Augusta preached to the boys about evil. She taught them that women were creatures who corrupted men and defiled Christ. The only time Ed and Henry were let out of her sight was to go to school, although they were forbidden from making any friends. Not that this made much difference. Ed, he was intelligent, effeminate, and kinda weird-looking. In short, he was a bully's dream come true. After teenage years marred by endless beatings, Ed graduated school and fled back to Augusta's cold embrace. He never socialized again. On April 1st, 1940, God played his cruelest April Fool's joke on all of the family. George Philip Gein was carried off by a heart attack, leaving his now 30-something sons all alone with their domineering mother. It was even worse than you're probably imagining. If pre-dead husband Augusta was a fanatic, post-dead husband Augusta was a flaming lunatic. She forced it into Ed and Henry's skulls that all women were evil incarnate, that the entire world was against them. When Henry tried to escape her clutches, starting a relationship with a divorced mother of 2 in Plainfield, she denounced him as well. A good older brother to the end, Henry tried to convince Ed to side with him against their mother. Sadly, though, Ed had already chosen his side. In winter of 1944, a fire broke out on the furthest reaches of the Gein farm. The fire brigade went screaming over in their trucks to find Ed in a state of agitation, claiming his older brother had vanished in the blaze. After a long search through the smoke-filled woods, police found Henry lying face down, a savage blow to the back of the head. The coroner recorded death by smoke inhalation, and Ed was never even questioned. When news of Henry's death reached Augusta, the old woman suffered a massive stroke that left her badly disabled. Finally, after nearly 4 decades of existence, Ed Gein's wish had come true. He was now completely alone with his beloved and awful mother. The next year was one of almost complete isolation. From late 1944 to the end of 1945, Ed and Augusta lived alone, seeing almost no one. They were doing nothing except cultivating their already toxic relationship until it reached Chernobyl levels of radioactivity. It was a year of optimism in the rest of the country, though, a year in which a war was won on 2 continents and young men returned home to cheers. But out on their farm in Plainfield, all of this passed Ed and Augusta by. Indeed, the only significant thing that happened to them that year was when when Augusta made a rare trip outside with Ed to buy straw from a man named Smith. When they reached Smith's house, the duo witnessed him beating a dog to death while an unknown woman begged him to stop. Seeing this, Augusta became livid, not because she was watching an innocent creature suffer, but because the mystery woman was not Smith's wife. Back home, Augusta stepped up her teachings to Ed that all females were guilty of lust. Not that her teachings lasted much longer, though. On December 29, 1945, a second stroke carried Augusta off to her eternal reward. Suddenly, alone, 39-year-old Ed did the only thing he knew how. He sealed off Augusta's room, preserving it exactly as his mother had left it. Then he shut up and boarded all but 2 rooms in their creaking house, and slowly he descended into madness. As 1946 rumbled by, Ed Gein became hooked on lurid horror novels and pornography. He mail-ordered books on Nazi medical experiments and female anatomy, and he began teaching himself taxidermy. Finally, in 1947, something in Ed Gein snapped. He began robbing the graves of women who were buried in the Plainfield Cemetery, digging up the bodies by the dead of night, removing their hearts, heads, genitals, and intestines before returning them to their crypts. Much later, after his arrest, Ed Gein would say that he went to the cemetery in a daze, that he had visions of grave robbing, but he never thought he actually went through with it. The record, though, it says otherwise. Today it's estimated that Gein robbed the graves of over 40 women from cemeteries all across the state. By the 1950s, he was no longer even returning the bodies to their tombs. Instead, he dragged the bodies of these unknown sisters, mothers, daughters, and wives back to his remote farmhouse and practiced taxidermy on them, patiently learning his craft. Despite this private madness, Gein still managed to semi-function in public. He took odd handyman jobs around Plainfield in order to survive, and even occasionally got work as a babysitter. To show his gratitude, he would give his sometime employers packages of meat that he called venison. Given what we know now, it does seem rather likely that what was in those parcels was probably not venison.
Nope.
As 1954 dawned, the nearly 50-year-old Gein was now a prolific grave robber, likely cannibal, and taxidermist of human skin. But there's one thing that he wasn't just yet. He wasn't yet a serial killer. Despite the hot-blooded likely murder of Henry 10 years earlier, Gein hadn't graduated to the sort of cold-blooded, premeditated slaughter that made guys like Ted Bundy and Jeffrey Dahmer so famous. Sadly, though, that last taboo was about to be broken. No one knows for sure how many people Ed Gein killed. He never confessed, and the state was unwilling to spend much money uncovering his gruesome crimes. As such, there are some who think Gein may have begun his murder spree prior to 1954. Certainly, he's been linked to many Wisconsin missing person cases, although it's also possible that he's simply become a useful scapegoat for any unsolved murder. But there's no ambiguity about what happened on the 8th of December 1954. That cold winter's night, Gein traveled to Pine Grove, some 10 miles north of Plainfield. He walked into the local tavern where Mary Hogan worked. She was a middle-aged woman who looked not unlike Augusta. Gein shot and killed Hogan and dragged her corpse out into the snow. He loaded her onto a sledge and took her back to his farmhouse. There, he chopped her up with an axe and turned her body parts into furniture. Hogan's murder, it marked a major step for Gein, but it wasn't the most truly disturbing thing that he had yet done. By the winter of 1954, Gein's activities in his lonely farmhouse had crossed into almost demonic territory. And it's at this point that I'll probably want to warn you that the next section is not really for the faint of heart, so I'm not going to blame you if you do actually want to turn off and watch something else right now. But with that in mind, let's continue. The things Gein did to the bodies he stole, it almost defies comprehension. He sawed off the tops of women's severed heads to turn their skulls into soup bowls. He stuffed their faces and hung them on walls like hunting trophies. Beneath his bed, the butcher of Plainfield kept a box of human noses alongside a box of female genitals. There's also rumors that 2 of these severed vulvas appeared to belong to girls below the age of 15. Perhaps even more perversely, Gein used people's bodies to tailor his own clothes. There are credible stories of police finding a belt made of human flesh at Gein's house, buckled with human nipples. There are legs turned into tights and corsets that are fashioned from skin. Freakiest of all, Ed Gein took the torso of one woman and turned it into a tanned jacket, complete with a heavy pair of breasts. On moonlit nights, he would wear it alongside a mask of skin and dance around outside, the cold blue night of the moon casting strange shadows on his twirling and mutilated form. After he was caught, Gein would tell investigators that he'd always secretly wanted to be a woman, but judging from what we know of Gein's crimes and his victims, it seems more likely that he secretly wanted to be one woman, his mother. Over the next 3 years, Gein's madness, it grew in silence, away from the eyes of Plainfield's residents. In the cemetery, the corpses of large middle-aged women continued to disappear, their empty tombs unnoticed by their blissfully ignorant families. Finally, as winter settled over Wisconsin once more, Gein's demons, they got the better of him. On November the 16th, 1957, 58-year-old Bernice Worden was opening up her hardware store in Plainfield when Gein stepped inside and shot her dead. With the town nearly empty for the start of hunting season, Gein was able to sneak Worden's body out to his car and drive her back to his farm unnoticed. He had big plans for his latest victim, plans that would utilize all of his dubious skills. Little did he know that the woman's body already cooling in the back of his car would be the one that ended his reign of terror. On November the 15th, Frank Worden decided to drop by his mum's hardware store in the center of Plainfield. A sheriff's deputy, Frank was trained to notice people acting suspiciously, and there were few people in town who acted quite as suspiciously as Plainfield's resident weirdo, Ed Gein. The day that Frank stopped in on his mum, he noticed Gein lurking around the store. At the time, Frank pushed it from his mind, but 24 hours later, it was back at the forefront. It was 5 p.m. on November the 16th, and Bernice Worden, she was missing. Unlocking her store, Frank found a long slick of blood leading to the crisp snow outside. The last name written in the register of sales was Ed Gein. It was now around 8 hours since Gein had shot Bernice Worden dead and carted her body away, but Frank was only acting on a justified hunch when he called up the station and asked them to investigate the killer. In the back of Frank's mind, there doubtless must have been a flicker of hope that his mother was still alive. If that thought had ever existed, it was about to be extinguished in the most brutal way possible. Shortly after Frank's call, Plainfield police arrested Ed Gein as he was coming out of a grocery store. The handyman acted confused, like he didn't know what was going on. But it was too late for games. The play, it was over. All that remained was its grisly denouement. That night, police carried out a raid on Gein's farm. In the freezing darkness, they first searched the barn. What they found there would set the tenor for the rest of the night. Bernice Worden's corpse was hanging upside down from a beam, completely gutted, and its head missing. So badly had she been mutilated that many of the officers initially thought that her body was that of an animal. Inside the house, things only got worse. The farmhouse Ed once shared with Augusta and Henry had decayed into a toxic swamp. Refuse littered the floors, while fat, bloated flies crawled across every surface. On the stove, Bernice Worden's heart had sat in a metal pan ready for cooking. Human organs, they filled the freezer. In a paper bag, the head of Mary Hogan grinned up at the investigators, now little more than a rotting skull. You already know what else they found. Their furniture made from skin, the mounted heads, the female bodies chopped and torn apart with blind hatred. Finally, just past 4 a.m. on the morning of November the 17th, someone found Bernice Worden's head wrapped in a bloodied sack. Twine had been hammered into her skull. Gein later admitted that he'd intended to use it as a decoration. According to the book Deviants by Harold Schechter, Wisconsin police officer Art Schlee was so disturbed by what he saw that night that he beat Gein's head against a brick wall until the monster confessed to the murders. Within months, Schlee would be dead of a heart attack, killed, his friends said, by the memories of that horrific night. After Gein was taken into custody, he remarked casually that he had no idea how many people he'd killed. It was only when police searched Plainfield Cemetery and found so many empty graves that they came to believe Worden and Hogan were the only victims. On the day after his arrest, on November the 18th, 1957, Ed Gein awoke to find himself a celebrity. His story, it gripped America. The papers carried lurid details of his house of horrors. Gawpers, they came from across the state and beyond to get a look at the scene of his crimes. Remember, this was the age of American innocence. The economy, it was okay. The middle class was expanding, and the optimism of the post-war years, it was still lingering. In such a society, Ed Gein's crimes, they seemed even more sensational. The fascination was helped along by the media. That December, Ed Gein's home would appear on the covers of both Life and Time. On November the 21st, Gein was hauled before Wilshire County Court. He entered a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity. It didn't take long for the state of Wisconsin to decide that the feeling was mutual. In January of 1958, Gein was judged mentally unfit to stand trial. He was detained at Wisconsin's Central State Hospital for the criminally insane. This was the start of an incarceration that would last for the rest of his life. And perhaps his story, it would have ended there, were it not for a very American twist. One of the Wisconsinites avidly following Gein's trial was the Milwaukee pulp writer Robert Bloch. Fascinated by Gein's creepy relationship with his mother, Bloch decided to incorporate it into the novel that he was working on. And this was a little book called Psycho. In Bloch's vision, handyman Ed Gein became Norman Bates, owner of the Bates Motel. When the book debuted in 1959, it caused a sensation. Barely a year had passed before the legendary director Alfred Hitchcock bought the rights and transformed it into a movie. If Ed Gein was aware of his growing celebrity, he didn't show it. At Central State Hospital, the cannibal serial killer gained a reputation for being mild-mannered. He worked as a carpenter, then as a medical orderly. People found him polite and even kind. After 10 years, Gein was finally declared competent to stand trial. On November 7, 1968, he was tried for the murder of Bernice Worden. Interestingly, the state didn't bother to prosecute Gein for Mary Hogan's death. It was thought that it would waste too much money and that one murder conviction would be enough. Still, Gein freely confessed to the crime. 1 week later, on November 14th, Gein was found guilty of first-degree murder. It was almost exactly 11 years to the day that he had shot Bernice Worden in cold blood and mutilated her body for his own gratification. Faced with such a crime, you might think that the jury recommended Gein for the electric chair, but that didn't happen. Gein was found to have been insane at the time of Worden's death, and he was recommitted to Central State Hospital. And that was kind of that. Ed Gein did almost nothing of consequence for the rest of his life. In 1974, he petitioned to be freed, stirring up a media frenzy, but his case was denied and the newspapers moved on. This was the year of Watergate, what was one demented serial killer stacked against the high crimes and misdemeanors of men in high office. But while Gein, the man, was fading into obscurity, Gein the legend, it was only growing. In 1974, Tobe Hooper released a low-budget flick that was as horrific for audiences as Psycho had been in 1960. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre drew on Ed Gein's crimes to create the character of Leatherface, the chainsaw-wielding serial killer who wears a mask of human skin. Nor would Hooper be the only one to take inspiration from the Butcher of Plainfield. Thomas Harris would draw from the same well when creating the serial killer Buffalo Bill for the 1988 book Silence of the Lambs. By then, though, the man who'd inspired all of those stories, he was long gone. On July 26, 1984, Ed Gein breathed his last in Mendota Mental Health Institute. He'd been carried off by lung cancer, aged 77. In a ghoulish twist, his body was interned in the very cemetery that he'd robbed so many times some 30 years earlier. In 1991, the film adaptation of Silence of the Lambs became only the third movie in history to win all Big Five Oscars. Although Ed Gein is never mentioned by name, the buzz was still big enough that a slew of books began to emerge about the Wisconsin killer. Before long, this strange mama's boy had the sort of fame usually reserved only for men who have changed the world, not turned their neighbors into a matching set of tables and chairs. In the year 2000, someone finally stole Ed Gein's tombstone from Plainfield Cemetery. As ironic as the idea is, it does get at something darker at the heart of human nature, our fascination with the perpetrators of awful acts. By simply doing something gruesome, Gein managed to become famous in a way that thousands of doctors, scientists, and artists never will. More to the point, he became more famous than his victims. No one would ever commission, write, or watch a biographic of Mary Hogan or Bernice Worden, but here we are, willing to talk to you about a man who ended their lives. While mass murderers like Stalin and Hitler changed history, Ed Gein simply survived a terrible childhood before turning all of that misery on women that didn't deserve it. By sheer fluke, he then became associated with 3 horror movies that everybody watching this has certainly heard of. Maybe there's a lesson in his life that we can learn, a lesson about celebrity and the way we ignore those who suffer in favor of those that cause the suffering. Or maybe there's just nothing to learn here at all in this tale of perversion. But there's one thing we can't deny. The Butcher of Plainfield still exerts a terrible hold over our imaginations, and in some ways, Ed Gein's ghost still haunts us to this very day. So I really hope you found that video, gonna say horrific, because that's what it was. If you're still watching at the end here, well, good for you. That was brutal. If you did like it, give it a thumbs up. If you didn't like it, probably give it a thumbs down. Do subscribe for more, less brutal stuff in the future. And as always, thank you for watching.